Have you ever heard this statement, you can't get there from here? Well, we may have that problem as well if we're dealing with a security manager that can't communicate with a firewall. So let's imagine in our topology here that we have this security management server on the 192.168.1 network at .110 that's been configured to manage firewall 1 as a gateway and also firewall 2 as a gateway. Initially, when we add these gateways to be managed by this security manager, it's going to ask us for the initial password that's going to kick off the secure internal communications process. And when the internal communications, the SIC, is all set up, it's going to be using SSL with digital certificates. But initially, to get the ball rolling, they're going to use an initial password. So if the manager is never able to set up secure internal communications, there could be some issues with basic connectivity between the manager and the gateway. So we'd want to make sure from an IP routing perspective that we had access between the manager and the gateway. We'd also want to make sure that any ports that are associated with SIC are also being allowed. And so here are 5 common ports that are associated with SIC. And as we look at our topology, the manager and firewall 1 being on the same subnet wouldn't have any issues with a gateway or firewall between those two entities. However, for this manager getting over to a second firewall, we need to make sure that this gateway, which is being used by the manager to access gateway number 2, firewall 2, is allowing all the communications back and forth so that SIC can happen. Now, another scenario is that we got secure internal communications set up and working, and then all of a sudden, at some future point, it stops working. And at that point, we may want to look at what changed in the network. Did we have new access control lists or filters or policies that are filtering one or more ports that are being used by SIC? Or did something just go wrong on either the gateway or the manager and we need to reset it? And if we do need to reset the communications, it's really pretty simple. Number one, we'd go to the manager and we go to the properties of the gateway that it's managing and reset the communications using a new initial password. But before that's going to work, we'd also need to go to the gateway. And for this discussion, let's imagine that it's this manager computer and firewall 1 that can't communicate. We'd also need to go to firewall 1 and go to the command line interface and run a tool called cpconfig. And then from within cpconfig at the command line, we can tell it that we want to set up a new initial password for secure internal communications. And then once that new password's in place on the gateway, and we've also configured the same password on the manager, we can then set up the new internal secure communications between those two entities. So here in Smart Console, over here on the left, we have gateways and servers selected. We can see that we have our manager, and then we have a big X next to firewall 1. So if we hover over firewall 1 here, it indicates that secure internal communication is not operational with firewall 1. Verify that SIC is initialized or was not reset. So what we could do right here is just double click on firewall 1 to bring up the properties of firewall 1. And under general properties, under secure internal communication, we can click on the communication button right here. And here it's indicating that trust is established, but it's not working. So we click on test SIC status. It indicates there's a problem, that there's a missing certificate. Because behind the scenes, SIC is using digital certificates and SSL for their secure communications. So we'll click on close and let's go ahead and click on reset. So when we do that, we'll click on yes to continue. It says the reset's done. We'll click on OK. And now let's go ahead and put a new password in. I'm going to use the lab password to start over with the secure internal communication between this manager and the gateway. And then before we click on initialize, we need to run over to the command line interface on firewall 1 and run cpconfig to set the password up there for the initial communications as well. So here on firewall 1, we'll log in as admin. We'll supply our lab password. And then from here, we'll type in cpconfig and press enter. From the pick list, we want option number 5 regarding secure internal communication. So we'll press 5, press enter. Then it's asking, would you like to change the activation key? And we're going to type in Y for yes. It's warning us it's going to stop some services. We'll hit Y to continue. And then we'll supply the initial password that we just supplied over on the manager as well. And having supplied that, we'll confirm it and then press enter. And it's asking me to type the password correctly both times. So I'll give it one more shot. There's 1 and there's 2. And that looks better. Then we'll type in a 10 to exit. And it's going to restart the services. And while that's cooking, let's go back to our security management server. So back here on the management server, we'll go ahead and click on initialize right here. And now down here it indicates that trust is established. We'll click on OK. It's rereading in the interfaces associated with that gateway. We'll click on close. And then we'll click on OK. We'll publish our changes by clicking on publish. And then the last step is we want to go ahead and install policy. If we had any policies installed on that gateway, we want to go ahead and reapply those. And we can do that by clicking on the install policy icon right here, and then clicking install, and then giving that a moment to confirm that it gets deployed. In this nugget, we walk through the steps to reset the secure internal communications between the manager and the gateway. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.